welcome back into another video of Matt's Sports Talk. Now, I mentioned in my last video talking about all the men's recap, or recapping all the men's games. I laid out a little bit of what the playoff clinching scenarios would be in terms of a potential, or at least in terms of a specific seed, trying to get into that number 4 seed in order to get the final home playoff game. So that was on the men's side. And I did want to record this separate video talking about the women's side, because the women's side is a little bit more complicated. So without further ado, let's dive in. So obviously I talked in my women's recap video, which you can find on my channel. I talked about all of the different playoff clinch, or I talked about what the current standings are for the women's side. And of course, and if you and I'll give you a brief refresher in case you found this video and haven't seen my previous video. So I'll give you a quick rundown of the current women's standings. Indiana Wesleyan 13-1, Marion 12-2, St. Francis 11-3, Spring Arbor 9-5, Mount Vernon and Huntington 6-8, Bethel 5-9, Goshen 4-10, Grace 3-11, and Taylor 1-13. So those are your updated women's standings. And I alluded to at the top of my previous women's video, I talked about how I think I'll stay here on YouTube for the rest of the regular season and postseason during these daily recaps. For me, it's easier that way. And I mentioned how I think I'll just use my Spotify podcast for a full season recap once we get to the very end of the season, after the national tournament is over. Whenever the Crossroads League teams lose in the national tournament, then I'll do a full season recap of just, how everybody did in the conference, where they finished, and that sort of thing. So make sure that you stay tuned for that. You can actually find my podcast on Spotify. If you search Matt Sports Talk and click on the account where there's a picture of a basketball next to it, that is me. So make sure that you follow me there and be notified when I upload any podcast recordings. So without further ado, let's dive into the women's side. Again, this is a little bit more complicated than the men's side. And I did not want to dive in too much to the men's side because it's still super wide open. There's still 4 games left in conference, so anything can happen. The women's side, it's a little bit different. So, and obviously the bottom is, well, I'll start with the bottom because the top gets a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to start towards the bottom. I'll start with Taylor. They're sitting 1-13 in the conference. In order for them, they are sitting 3 games behind Goshen with 4 games to play. Goshen, now they still have to play Goshen a second time, but Goshen beat them the first time, so the Maple Leafs would hold that tiebreaker. Now, now Goshen and Grace split, and so far, and now I believe Taylor and Grace. Now, let me double check that with Taylor and Grace, because I know that Goshen and Grace played each other twice, and those 2 teams split. So looking at the Trojans, they lost to Grace the first time. Actually, okay, so they lost to Grace twice, and Grace and Goshen split. So that would mean that in that scenario, that Goshen would be ahead of Taylor because of splitting with Grace, and Taylor got swept by Grace. So that would mean that the Maple Leafs then would hold that common opponent tiebreaker. So in order for the Trojans to make the Crossroads League tournament, that means Taylor has to win out and have Goshen lose out. Taylor then would be at 5 wins, Goshen would only be at 4. Now, if Goshen won 1 and Taylor won out, then that wouldn't matter because Goshen would still be ahead of them with splitting with Grace. And then, of course, I had mentioned that Taylor got swept by Grace. So that's the scenario there. Meanwhile, for Grace, on the other hand, now for them, they hold the head-to-head over Taylor because they beat him twice. So for Grace has to win at least 2 games, and then if Grace wins 2 out of 4, and Taylor loses 1, or if Taylor wins 1, Grace wins 2, then Grace is guaranteed to be ahead of Taylor. For Grace to make the postseason, now remember, Grace and Goshen split, so it gets a little bit more complicated. But ideally, for the Lady Lancers, they would clinch a playoff spot if they won 3 out of 4, and Goshen only won 1. So, but again, Goshen and Grace, it's a little bit too complicated to give you an exact scenario on who would be in between those two teams. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time diving into that. But in terms of Taylor and Goshen, then the only way Taylor would make the postseason is if Grace only won one, Taylor ran the table, and Goshen lost out. That is the only scenario where Taylor would be in the postseason. So now going up to Bethel. Bethel's currently sitting 5-9. They swept the Maple Leafs both times in the regular season, so the Pilots do hold that head-to-head tiebreaker. Now, for Bethel, in order to clinch a playoff spot for them, they would have to win 2 and have Goshen lose 2 in order to guarantee to be ahead of them, because they technically hold a 2-game lead because of the head-to-head, and there's 4 games remaining. So again, that scenario is still a little bit complicated. We're obviously going to know more by the time we get into the middle of next week, and especially after the games next Wednesday. That's when we're really going to know who is going to be potentially seeded where in the tournament. So now we get up into the little bit more complicated range, talking about Huntington and Mount Vernon. Now, the thing for Huntington and Mount Vernon is Spring Arbor is currently 3 games ahead of them at 9 wins. In order for Mount Vernon and Huntington to get up to get the 4 seed, Mount Vernon and Huntington would have to win it. Now remember, Mount Vernon and Huntington split. Spring Arbor swept Spring Arbor swept Mount Vernon. Spring Arbor plays Huntington the second time coming up on Saturday. So if Spring Arbor beats Huntington on Saturday, then of course we know Huntington would not be able to catch Spring Arbor because Spring Arbor would hold the head-to-head. We know Spring Arbor holds the head-to-head over Mount Vernon. So if Spring Arbor wins 1, that would eliminate Mount Vernon from getting to the 4 seed, and it would also eliminate Huntington from getting to the 4 seed, because Spring Arbor still has to play St. Francis again on the 22nd. Huntington and St. Francis split. So again, then it would go to more league road wins, and that definitely would favor Spring Arbor. So if Spring Arbor and St. Francis split, then Huntington would not be able to catch Spring Arbor really in any scenario if Spring Arbor wins 1 more game. So if Spring Arbor wins 1 more game, they would officially clinch no worse than the 4 seed. Now, whereas for Huntington has to run the table and have Spring Arbor lose out in order for Huntington to get to the 4 seed. So obviously, those are the scenarios there. For Mount Vernon to get to the 4 seed, they have the same exact scenario. Mount Vernon would have to run the table and have Spring Arbor lose out. Now Mount Vernon, they still have to play the top 3 ranked teams. They play St. Francis Wednesday, they're at Iwu Saturday, they're at Marion next Wednesday, then they're home against Grace to round out the regular season. So personally for me, I think Mount Vernon is only going to win 1 of those, that being Grace on the 22nd. So I think Mount Vernon can only max out at 7 wins. For Huntington, now in that scenario for Huntington I think has to at least get to 8 wins in order to guarantee themselves to be ahead of Mount Vernon, especially if St. Francis beats Mount Vernon Wednesday. Then St. Francis would have swept Mount Vernon, and Huntington and St. Francis split, meaning that if Huntington and Mount Vernon ended up being tied, Huntington would be ahead of Mount Vernon because of the common opponent tiebreaker with beating St. Francis. So obviously we're going to know a lot more after the games on Wednesday, but that's just some really good and helpful information, I hope, to you, that you know exactly where some of these teams will end up being. So those are the scenarios for the top 4 teams. Now, for Spring Arbor, they can actually get to the number 2 seed, but in order for Spring Arbor to get to the 2, they have to run the table, have Marion lose out, and have St. Francis only win 1. Now, personally for me, I don't think that scenario is going to happen, but we've seen some very strange things this year in the conference, as competitive as it is, so you never know. So that's the scenario for Spring Arbor. We know if Spring Arbor wins 1, they officially clinch no worse than the 4 seed, meaning they would be the last team to host in the opening round tournament game coming up 2 weeks from Wednesday. So now's when it really gets interesting. Marion and St. Francis. Now remember, St. Francis beat Marion the first time. So if St. Francis beats Marion again, Marion would then only be able to max out at 15 wins. If St. Francis sweeps Marion, St. Francis would only be able to get to 15 wins. And we know if that scenario happens and those two teams finish tied, then St. Francis would be ahead of Marion because of the head-to-head. So that would mean St. Francis would be the 2 seed, Marion would be the 3 seed. Whereas if Marion and St. Francis split, then as long as Marion gets to at least 15 wins, they would be no worse than the 2 seed. St. Francis then would only be able to get to 14, meaning St. Francis would officially lock the 3 seed. So those are the scenarios there. Now, where Indiana Wesleyan comes into play is Indiana Wesleyan has beat Marion once, split with St. Francis. So now what does that mean? Now, if Indiana Wesleyan only wins 2 out of the last 4, if Marion gets to 15, if all 3 of them, as far as that goes, gets to 15 wins, St. Francis would then jump ahead of Indiana Wesleyan for the number 1 seed, because especially if St. Francis sweeps Marion and Mount Vernon and Marion end up splitting, then St. Francis would jump ahead and be the 1 seed, Iowa would be the 2 seed, Marion would be the 3 seed. Now on the flip side of that, if Indiana Wesleyan wins the next 3 games and gets to 16 wins, and St. Francis beats Marion on Saturday, Indiana Wesleyan will have clinched the 1 seed if they're able to win the next 3 games. And then going into a senior day game, that Iowa would just be playing to build momentum going into the league tournament. Now, obviously, you would obviously want to beat Marion, hope to beat Marion a second time, especially on senior day. It's on your home floor, and obviously you would want that win. But in terms of any playoff seeding in that scenario, then the playoff seeding for Iowa would not matter, because Iowa would have already clinched the 1 seed with winning the next 3 games and getting to 16 wins, especially if St. Francis ends up sweeping Marion, and then they both could only be at 15. Iowa would already be at 16, and then Iowa would not be able to gain or lose anything on that senior day game at home against Marion. So now on the flip side of that, at least right now, if Indiana Wesleyan loses out, Marion and St. Francis jump ahead of them, and again, I don't think that scenario is going to happen, but somehow if it did, Indiana Wesleyan will be no worse than the 3 seed, even if Spring Arbor ends up running the table, because Indiana Wesleyan swept Spring Arbor both times in the regular season, so that head-to-head tiebreaker would favor the Wildcats, meaning that the Wildcats definitely would be no worse than the 3 seed if somehow they ended up losing out. So obviously there's a lot on the table, and again, I know it might seem a little bit complicated, but those are officially the scenarios that could easily determine who is the number 1, 2, and 3 seed. Now, I will say one final thing. If Indiana Wesleyan wins the next 3 and Marion ends up running the table, then St. Francis would only be at best the 3 seed. And if Marion ends up beating Indiana Wesleyan on the 22nd, and they both finish tied at 16 wins, then Indiana West, they would be tied. Then the common opponent tiebreaker potentially would not come into play. The league road tiebreaker would both favor. Well, actually, would not matter either, because both Marion and Iowa would be 9-0 on the road in conference. Then the next tiebreaker would be the most recent Massey rating, and the Massey rating would definitely favor Iowa being ahead of Marion. So in the event that Indiana Wesleyan wins the next 3 games, and in the event that Marion runs the table, Indiana Wesleyan would still be the number 1 seed, even after the senior day game, because of it being ahead of Marion with the higher Massey rating. So those are just a couple of the scenarios for Indiana Wesleyan to clinch the number 1 seed. So now obviously, anything can happen. Of course, we know that anything can happen there, and anything can happen. It's still super wide open. There's still 4 games left to go in the regular season. So for the Wildcats, and really, not just for the Wildcats, but for any team in general, any team in general just has to focus on playing 1 game at a time. And that's the biggest thing. You want to build momentum, yes, but every team needs to, including Iowa, just needs to focus on 1 game at a time. And obviously, I know that for some teams, they have a big winning streak snapped, and then they think, well, and then they kind of get too down. They get down on themselves about it, and then they lose focus. Well, I hope that's not the case. Obviously that happens to even the best of the best, even in the NCAA teams. We saw yesterday with South Carolina, having 57 straight wins in the SEC conference. And they saw that, and that dated back to December of 2021, and South Carolina just saw that winning streak in the SEC snapped yesterday with the 4-point loss to number 4 Texas, and both teams were ranked in the top 5, so obviously it was still a really good game. But that just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter what division level it is. Each conference is just so tough, not just in the SEC on the NCAA Division I side, but also here in the Crossroads League. It's so tough when you have so many teams that are this good. Maybe their record doesn't indicate it, but they still have a really good amount of talent on their team. And obviously you look at Indiana Wesleyan, Mount Vernon, or Indiana Wesleyan, Marian and St. Francis. All three of them being nationally ranked, all three of them in the top 20, and just being loaded with just an unbelievable amount of talent. Not just with one player in particular, but several players, and as a team, obviously it's a team sport, it's a team effort. So obviously, it's just really amazing to see. It's just really amazing to see just how good the competition level is. So obviously, it's going to be fun to watch, and I hope this really specific breakdown of the tie-breaking scenarios really helped you out. And if it did, please like this video, leave me a comment down below, or subscribe to my channel. I appreciate any feedback that you give me. So I'm excited for this closing stretch of the Crossroads League regular season. Excited for the postseason getting ready to start here in about 2 weeks. But obviously, one game. Let's focus one game at a time during these last 4 games of the regular season, and then go from there. So thanks so much for tuning into this video, and have a great rest of your day and week.